The wind came down off the ridge the way it always did in November low, and mean threading through the pines like it had a grudge against warmth. It pushed against the cabin walls and found every gap it could, making the timbers groan and the single window above the kitchen sink rattle in its frame. Margot Hale didn't look up. She was sitting at the table with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, watching the fire in the stone hearth burn itself down to coals. The mug had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She hadn't noticed. Or maybe she had and just didn't care enough to do anything about it. That was the thing about grief she had learned. It didn't announce itself. It didn't come in like a storm you could prepare for. It settled in quietly like frost, and before you knew it, everything was just a few degrees colder than it used to be. On the wall above the mantel, tacked with a single nail, was a photograph. Four people in desert camouflage squinting into a sun so bright it nearly washed their faces out. She was on the left. Jim was beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his mouth open mid-laugh at something she couldn't remember anymore. The other two were names she still said some mornings when she woke up in the dark. Henderson, Kowalski, both gone before Jim. Jim gone 2 years after them. She looked away from the photo. Ranger was lying near the door, chin resting on his front paws, amber eyes open and tracking every small movement in the room. He was a German Malinois, lean and precise, the way working dogs are, with a dark muzzle and a coat the color of dry wheat. Jim had trained him. Jim had loved him in the specific, unspoken way that men who've seen too much tend to love the things that ask nothing of them. When Jim died, the base chaplain had called Margot personally. He said the right things. Everyone said the right things. But it was the transport officer who told her about Ranger, that Jim had left written instructions witnessed and filed that the dog was to go to his wife, not to the unit, not to another handler, to Margot. She hadn't understood it then. She was starting to. She pushed back from the table and stood her joints, reminding her that 58 wasn't 38, and pulled her wool coat from the hook beside the door. Ranger was on his feet before she even reached for the leash. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I know." Outside, the world was blue-gray and cold, the kind of cold that had weight to it. The trees on the ridge stood perfectly still, which meant the wind had paused, which meant it was gathering itself for something worse. Margot had been in Montana long enough to read the mountain the way she used to read terrain, in the field, not with certainty but with respect. The trail ran north along the ridge through a stand of aspen whose white trunks caught the pale morning light, then curved east toward the drop-off above Coldwater Hollow. Jim had walked this trail every morning when they were stationed together and he came home on leave. Then he walked it alone every day for the 2 years they lived here before his last deployment. After he died, Margot started walking it too. She wasn't sure when it became a ritual. Somewhere between the funeral and the first winter, she supposed. It didn't feel like exercise. It felt like keeping a promise she'd never made out loud. Ranger moved ahead of her nose, low tail steady. He was always like this on the trail, purposeful, calm, reading the ground the way he'd been trained to. Margot had tried once to count the number of times Ranger's instincts had been right and hers had been wrong since she'd had him. She'd stopped counting somewhere around 30. Inside the cabin above the mantel, and just to the left of Jim's photograph, there was a topographic map of Flathead County tacked to the wall. Jim had put it up himself during one of his leaves, marking it with a black pen trail, distances, weather patterns, places to avoid an early thaw. Most of the marks were practical, but in the northeast corner of the map near the area labeled Coldwater Hollow, there was a single circle drawn in red ink. No label, no note, just the circle. Margot had asked him about it once early on. He'd looked at the map for a moment, then said, "Just keeping track." And she had let it go the way you let things go when you trust someone completely and have no reason not to. She thought about that circle now as she always did on this stretch of the trail. She thought about it and kept walking. The hollow opened below her on the left, a narrow cut between two black limestone walls, deep enough that the light never quite reached the bottom, even at midday. The locals called it Coldwater Hollow, though there was no water there, cold or otherwise. The cold was just the air which seemed to pool down there and refused to move even in summer. People in Ridgemont gave it a wide berth, old habit mostly. Some places just accumulated that kind of reputation over time. Ranger was 30 feet ahead of her on the trail when he stopped. Not slowed, not paused to sniff something. Stopped. Complete and total, every muscle in his body going rigid in the space of one step. His head came up. His ears went forward. The fur along the ridge of his spine lifted slowly like something invisible was running a hand the wrong direction across it. Margot stopped too. She had seen this once before. Helmand Province, a dirt road outside a village whose name she'd already forgotten, Jim Walking Point with Ranger on lead. The dog had done the exact same thing, frozen mid-step, spine up head, lock forward. Jim had put his fist up without a word. Everyone stopped. Everyone waited. 40 seconds later, the EOD team found a pressure plate 6 feet ahead in the road. Margot stood still and listened. Wind in the pines, a distant creak of timber somewhere on the ridge. Nothing else. No movement in the hollow below. No light. No sound that she could identify as human. But Ranger wouldn't move. She said his name once quietly. He didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the mouth of the hollow below, locked on something she couldn't see or hear, reading information that was only available to him. She didn't push it. "Okay," she said. "Okay, we're done." She turned them both back toward the cabin, and as they walked, she felt the specific crawling unease of a soldier who has learned not to dismiss the things she can't explain. That night, she opened Jim's old field journal, the one she kept in the nightstand drawer, the one she hadn't been able to throw away, and found a blank page near the back. She picked up a pen and wrote 4 words. Ranger stopped at Coldwater. Then she closed the journal and turned off the light. She didn't sleep much. The dream was the same one she'd had intermittently for 2 years. Jim, standing at the end of a long corridor, turning toward her with something in his hand, trying to say something she couldn't hear. The corridor always ended before she reached him. She always woke up reaching. By 5:30, she was at the table again, with fresh coffee, watching the gray light come up through the window. Ranger was already awake. He was sitting at the door, not lying down, sitting spine straight, ears forward, facing north. Margot drank her coffee and watched him and didn't say anything for a long time. At 7, she put on her coat and boots and opened the door. Ranger didn't bolt ahead the way he usually did. He moved out carefully, nose immediately dropping to the ground, and turned north without any direction from her. She followed. The frost was hard and bright that morning, crackling under her boots with each step. The sky was pale silver, and the air smelled of pine resin and the iron cold of coming snow. Ranger moved with his head low and his tail level, tracking something, working something back and forth in whatever the part of him was that processed scent and memory and instinct all at once. He led her north along the ridge trail, then off it, cutting down a steep slope through a stand of young pine toward the eastern wall of Coldwater Hollow. She hadn't been down here before, hadn't had a reason. She moved carefully, watching her footing, trusting Ranger's direction. He stopped at the base of a fallen juniper, its bark black and crumbling from some old lightning strike, its root ball partially uprooted from the frozen ground. He circled it twice. Then he began to dig. It wasn't anxious digging or playful digging. It was the slow, deliberate kind, 2 paws working together, systematic. Way he dug when he found something during a search exercise and knew he needed to clear it carefully. Margot crouched down beside him. She brushed the loose dirt away with her gloved hand. The ground was frozen hard an inch below the surface, but something had disturbed it here recently enough that the frost hadn't fully reclaimed it. She worked her fingers through the cold earth, and after a moment they closed around something small and hard. She pulled it out. A bracelet, child-sized. Cheap elastic cord threaded with small plastic beads, some pink, some purple. One shaped like a star, tarnished with age and soil but intact. The kind of thing sold in the craft section of a drugstore The kind of thing a 10-year-old girl would pick out herself and wear every single day because she'd chosen it. Margot turned it over in her gloved fingers. On the underside of the star-shaped bead, someone had scratched letters into the plastic with something sharp, a pin maybe, or a small nail. The letters were tiny and worn, but readable. S-A-D-I-E. Margot went very still. She stayed crouched there in the frost for a long moment, the bracelet in her palm, Ranger sitting quietly beside her. The hollow below them was silent. The trees were still. Somewhere far above, a hawk made one long, slow circle and then was gone. She knew that name. Not from personal memory. She hadn't been in Ridgemont when it happened. Had moved here after, had learned it the way you learn local history in pieces from overheard conversations in faded paper. But she knew it. Sadie Brennan, 10 years old, missing 4 years ago, along with her friend Emmy Crane, 8 years old. They'd been riding bikes near County Road on a Saturday afternoon and had simply not come home. There had been a search, a big one by Ridgemont Standards volunteers, dogs, helicopters, 3 weeks of organized effort. The kind of search that gets coverage in the regional paper and brings casseroles to the families for a month. Then it stopped. The hats came off and the heads went down and the families eventually left town because there was nothing left to stay for. And the flyers faded to white on the boards they were tacked to, and Ridgemont went back to being Ridgemont. Margot had seen the last of those flyers at the post office. Someone had left it up long after everyone else had taken theirs down. She'd looked at those two small faces, Sadie's gap-toothed smile, Emmy's serious eyes, and felt a specific weight that falls on you when you understand that the worst thing has probably already happened to someone and that everyone has quietly accepted it. Damn. She looked down at the bracelet in her hand. Then she looked at Ranger. "Good boy," she said softly. He pressed his nose against her knee just once and then looked back toward the hollow. She drove into Ridgemont that afternoon, the bracelet wrapped carefully in a clean cloth and placed in her jacket pocket. The town sat at the base of the valley, small and unhurried, the kind of place that looked exactly the same in November as it did in July, except for the color. The post office was dark. The diner had 3 trucks outside it. The sheriff's substation was a single-story brick building on the corner of Main and Granger with a flag out front that needed replacing. Corbett Shea's patrol truck was parked in the side lot. Margot had known Corbett for about a year, which in Ridgemont terms meant she knew him reasonably well. He was 62, a deputy for 30 years, and he carried himself with the specific, tired dignity of a man who had seen enough of what people do to each other and had made his peace with the fact that most of it wasn't going to change. He was honest in the way that some people in law enforcement managed to remain honest, not because no one had ever offered them a reason not to be, but because they'd simply decided it wasn't worth the trade. He was the only person in Ridgemont Margot trusted without qualification. She found him at his desk with a cup of coffee and a stack of paperwork he looked extremely unlikely to finish. He looked up when she came in, registered her expression, and set the coffee down. "Margot," he said, "what happened?" She put the bracelet on his desk without preamble. He picked it up, turned it over, found the letters on the back of the star bead, and looked up at her. "Ranger found it," she said, "this morning. Bottom of the east wall, Coldwater Hollow, under a fallen juniper." Corbett looked at the bracelet for a long time. Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly. More like the expression of a man who has been quietly bracing for something for a long time and has now felt the first tremor. "The Brennan girl," he said. "That's what I thought." He set the bracelet down carefully and leaned back in his chair. "Margot, that case has been closed for 3.5 years. I know. The county investigator signed off on it. Presumed deceased. Filed. I know. If I open this up again based on a bracelet found by a dog—" "Turn it over," Margot said. "Look at the back more carefully." He picked it up again, tilted it toward the desk lamp. His eyes narrowed. Below the scratched name, almost too small to see without the right light, were three more letters carved with the same sharp instrument, VRC. Corbett was quiet for a moment. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a file not from the active cabinet, or never from the lower drawer, the one for things that weren't officially anything yet. He opened it and flipped through several pages until he found what he was looking for. He laid it flat on the desk so she could see. It was a property transfer record. Flathead County recorded 3.5 years ago. A parcel of land encompassing the eastern slope and canyon area locally known as Coldwater Hollow transferred to a private buyer. The buyer's name was Roland Veck. VRC, Corbett said quietly. Veck Ranch, Coldwater. He closed the file. He bought that land 6 months after the case closed. Margot looked at him. Tell me about Veck. Corbett was quiet for a moment, the way he got when he was choosing his words with care. Roland Veck has lived in this county for 25 years. He runs a cattle operation north of town, sits on the water board, helped rebuild the Ridgemont Fire Station after the flood in 2018. People here think well of him. And 4 years ago, Corbett looked at the wall for a moment. 4 years ago, when Sadie Brennan and Emmy Crane went missing, Roland Veck organized a search. 200 volunteers, 3 weeks. He was the one coordinating with state police, managing the grid searches, keeping the families informed. He stopped. He was the one who went to the Brennan house at the end of week 3 and told them it was time to stop, that they'd covered everything that could be covered. The room was quiet. He was the hero, Margot said. To everyone who was here, yes. And then he bought the land. Corbett didn't say anything to that. He picked up the bracelet again and held it, turning it slowly in his fingers. He was also the one, Corbett said more quietly now, who recommended the county formally close the investigation. He wrote a letter to the sheriff at the time, said continued searching was traumatizing the community, and that the evidence strongly suggested the girls had gone into the drainage system during the storm that week. He set the bracelet down. The sheriff signed the closure order 2 weeks later. Margot kept her face still. Did you believe that at the time? Corbett looked at her directly. No, he said, but I was a deputy and the sheriff signed it and the state investigator agreed, and Roland Veck had spent 3 weeks being the hardest working man in Flathead County, and every family in Ridgemont thought he was a saint. He paused. So I filed it. And you've been filing it ever since? Yes. She watched him for a moment. Then she said, I want to go back to the hollow. I want to look at the area more carefully before it snows. Margot, I'm not asking for official anything. I'm telling you what I'm doing. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up and reached for his coat. Then I'm going with you. They drove out in Corbett's truck, Ranger in the back seat, the heater running loud against the cold. Neither of them spoke much. There was a particular kind of silence between people who understand each other well enough to not need to fill it. Coldwater Hollow looked different in the afternoon light, less ominous, almost ordinary. The limestone walls just rock, and the shadows just shadows. Margot had found over the years that dangerous places rarely looked the part in daylight. The worst things she'd ever seen had happened in places that looked like nothing at all. Ranger was out of the truck before Corbett had the engine off. He moved straight toward the canyon's east wall, nose down, purpose absolute. Margot and Corbett followed. Ranger led them past the fallen juniper, past the place where the bracelet had been found, and continued south along the base of the wall. The ground here was rough, loose shale and frozen dirt, old deadfall, the skeletal remains of a rock slide that must have come down years ago. Corbett swept his flashlight across the wall face. Ranger stopped. He sat down directly in front of a section of the wall that looked at first glance exactly like every other section, rough limestone, dark with moisture, patched with dry lichen. Then he put one paw against the rock and held it there and looked back at Margot with an expression she had learned to read over 2 years of living with him. She stepped forward and looked more carefully. At eye level, partially obscured by a lip of rock and a dark smear of lichen, were marks in the stone, not natural fracture lines. Letters scratched by hand, uneven and effortful, made by something small and sharp, held by someone with small hands. She reached out and traced them with her finger. Sadie plus Emmy. Beneath the names on a second line in letters slightly smaller, as if the writer had been trying to compress something important into limited space, help us. Corbett stood behind her. She heard him exhale slowly. She stayed there for a moment with her fingers on the cold stone on those letters that had been here for God knows how long, waiting for someone to find them. She thought about Sadie Brennan, 10 years old, riding a bike 4 years ago, and she thought about what it meant that this message was still here, that it hadn't been found, that it had been here through 4 winters. She thought about the bracelet under the juniper. They were here, she said. They're marking their location. Corbett crouched beside her, studying the letters. Kids do this when they're trying to be found. Leave markers. He paused. It's protocol that search and rescue teaches in school. Leave signs as natural landmarks. Mark your position. These girls knew someone would eventually come back. Or they hoped. Ranger moved suddenly, pulling away from the wall and cutting east along the canyon floor. He stopped 10 feet away and began pawing at the ground near a narrow crack in the limestone where 2 sections of wall met at an angle. Margot and Corbett followed. The crack was shallow but barely wide enough to fit a hand into, but wedged into it, folded into a small square, and tucked behind a protruding lip of rock was a piece of paper. Corbett used his pocket knife to ease it out without touching it directly. He unfolded it carefully in the beam of his flashlight, holding it by the corners. It was torn from something larger, a brown paper bag maybe. The writing was in pencil, the letters small and careful, the way a child writes when they are trying very hard to be clear and don't have much space. He has cameras in the trees. Do not use radio near the water. The doors behind the burned tree. We are still here. We count the days. Please hurry. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The wind had come up, pushing cold air through the hollow, and the light was thinning toward a late afternoon. Somewhere on the ridge above, a branch snapped under the weight of ice. Corbett refolded the paper with great care. He looked at Margot. This changes everything, he said. Yes. If those girls are alive down here, somewhere in this canyon for 4 years, then someone has been keeping them alive, Margot finished, which means someone has been here, regularly, and that someone has a reason to want them close and hidden and not found. Corbett looked toward the canyon wall, toward the rock face and the darkness behind the deadfall, and the shadows that ran long and deep toward the hollow's interior. He looked at the note in his hand. He looked at Margot. The burned tree, he said quietly. Ranger was already moving. He led them east along the canyon floor, picking his way through the loose rock with the careful economy of a dog who has worked rough terrain before and sees no reason to waste energy on hesitation. Margot followed close Corbett behind her, their flashlights cutting thin white paths through the deepening gray. They found it 20 yards further in, a juniper dead for years, its bark stripped and blackened from a fire that must have burned hot and fast lightning strike maybe, or something deliberate. Its trunk was split near the base, fallen partially against the canyon wall, and where it rested against the limestone, it had created a narrow alcove of shadow and debris. Ranger walked directly to it and sat, not beside it, in front of it. Margot moved closer, pushing aside a curtain of dead branches, and put her hand against the rock face behind the fallen trunk. Her knuckles hit something that was not stone. She pressed harder, ran her palm across the surface. Beneath a thin skin of mud and crumbled rock, her fingers found metal cold, smooth, industrial. A seam, a frame. She traced the rectangle of it with both hands until she found in the lower right corner a corroded handle. She looked back at Corbett. His flashlight was on her face. She watched something settle in his expression. Not fear exactly, but the specific gravity of a man who understands that what comes next cannot be undone. You should call this in, he said, right now, before we go any further. I know. If those girls are in there, I know Corbett. She looked at the door. She looked at Ranger, who was watching her with his amber eyes completely calm, completely ready, waiting for whatever she decided. She thought about Jim's map, the red circle in the corner, just keeping track. She thought about what he might have known, what he might have been keeping track of. She straightened up and stepped back. "Make your call," she said to Corbett. "Get back up moving, but I'm not leaving this door until they arrive." Corbett already had his radio in his hand. He clicked it twice and moved away to speak in a low, careful voice, his back to the wind, his words disappearing into the cold. Margot stood with her hand on Ranger's head, both of them facing the door. Somewhere behind it, if a small girl's careful handwriting meant anything at all, two children were counting their days and waiting to be found. She had been too late for a lot of things in her life. She was not going to be too late for this. The backup never came. Corbett's radio gave him static and a dispatcher's voice that cut in and out like a signal trying to cross bad weather. He walked the length of the canyon floor twice, holding the unit above his head, turning in slow circles the way people do when they know it won't help but have to try anyway. The limestone walls of Coldwater Hollow swallowed transmission the same way they swallowed light, completely without apology. He came back to where Margot was standing. "I'm getting nothing reliable," he said. "I can drive to the ridge and get a clean signal, but that's 20 minutes out and 20 back." Margot looked at him. "Go. I'm not leaving you here alone." "You're not leaving me alone, Hallway." She put her hand on Ranger's head. "Go get your signal. I'll stay at the door. I won't go in." Corbett looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man calculating odds he didn't like. Then he looked at the metal door behind the burned juniper, half buried in mud and shadow, and something moved across his face that was older than professional caution. 20 minutes, he said. "You don't move. Go." She listened to his footsteps recede up the canyon floor, and then there was only the wind and the cold, and Ranger sitting precisely where he had been sitting, spine straight, eyes on the door. Margot crouched beside him. The temperature was dropping. She could feel it in her knees and in the tips of her fingers inside her gloves. The sky above the canyon walls had gone the color of old pewter, and somewhere behind that sky, snow was organizing itself. An hour, maybe less. She put her hand against the metal door again. It was warmer than the air around it. Not dramatically, not by much. But there was a difference, a faint, steady warmth coming from the other side, as though something on the other side was generating heat. Not a fire, more consistent than a fire. More mechanical. She pressed her ear to the surface. Beneath the wind, beneath the creak of the dead juniper's branches above her, she heard it. Very faint, very low. A hum. Electrical, rhythmic, the kind of sound that belongs to machinery rather than nature. She pulled back. Ranger growled once very quietly and then went still. Margot straightened. She looked toward the canyon entrance where Corbett had disappeared. She looked back at the door. She had told him she wouldn't go in. She was going to keep that promise for exactly as long as it was the right thing to do. She waited. 4 minutes later, Ranger's head came up. Not toward the door, toward the canyon entrance, toward the direction Corbett had gone. His ears went forward, and his body language shifted into something she recognized, not threat, assessment, something else. Recognition, almost. The specific attention a dog gives to a scent it knows. Then the sound reached her, too. Footsteps. But not Corbett's measured stride. These were deliberate and careful in the way that people are careful when they don't want to be heard, which is different from the way careful people simply walk. Margot stood up slowly and turned. Roland Vec came around the bend of the canyon wall with a flashlight in one hand, and his posture arranged into something she would later describe to herself as studied calm, the specific body language of a man who has prepared for this moment and is executing a version of it. He practiced somewhere quiet before he came here. He was bigger than she'd expected, 55 broad through the shoulders with a weathered face and light eyes that moved quickly across the scene. Ranger the door, her hands, her face, and then settled on her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He said her name, not a question, a statement with a faint note of something underneath it she couldn't identify yet. "Margot Hale," he said, "Jim's wife." The way he said Jim's name made the back of her neck tighten. "Vec," she said. He stopped about 15 feet from her. His flashlight moved to the door, then back to her face. He didn't look at Ranger, which she noted. Most people, when there's a dog in the room, look at the dog. The people who don't look are either very experienced with dogs or have made a prior decision to ignore them. And neither of those said good things about where this was going. "You shouldn't have come down here," he said. The tone was almost regretful, not threatening, not yet. More like a man watching someone make a mistake he genuinely wishes he could prevent. "Two children have been missing for 4 years, Margot said. Their names are on that wall." Vec glanced at the carved letters. Something moved across his face there and gone too fast to name. "Old marks," he said. "Kids used to come out here years ago, before I bought the land." "The paper wasn't old, Ed." He was quiet. "The note your girls left in the rock face," she said. "The pencil was still sharp. The paper wasn't weathered. Someone wrote that recently, Roland. Someone small with small hands who was very careful with their words." Vec's jaw tightened. Just once, just briefly. "I don't know what you found, but your initials are on the bracelet." He went still. Ranger's growl started low in his chest, building slowly. Margot put her hand out, not touching the dog, just present beside him, and Ranger held. Vec looked at her for a long moment. The studied calm was still there, but it was working harder now. Something underneath it was shifting, and she watched it shift the way she'd watched men shift in interrogation rooms, the moment when the version of events they'd prepared starts to cost more than it's worth. "You need to walk away from this," he said. "Quieter now. I'm not saying that as a threat. I'm saying it because there are people involved in this situation who don't operate the way I operate, who don't make the kinds of decisions I make." He paused. "If you push this, those girls are the ones who pay for it." It was the first time he'd acknowledged the girls existed. "Then help me get them out," Margot said. Something crossed his face that she would spend a long time afterward trying to name. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't even coldness. It was closer to exhaustion, the expression of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and has run out of the energy to pretend it isn't heavy. "I can't," he said. "Why?" He opened his mouth to answer. She never heard what he said. Something hit her from behind, not Vex, someone she hadn't heard, someone who had come along the canyon wall in the dark while Vec held her attention. The blow caught her at the base of the skull, not hard enough to knock her out completely, but hard enough to drop her to her knees, and in the half-second between impact and the ground she heard Ranger's bark explode through the hollow like a gunshot. Then her hands were on cold stone and the flashlight was spinning away from her, and the sound folded itself into something muffled and then into nothing at all. She came back to consciousness in stages. First sound, a low hum, close and steady, the same mechanical rhythm she'd heard through the door. Then warmth, real warmth, enclosed warmth, the kind that meant walls and a roof. Then pain specific and throbbing at the back of her head, radiating forward behind her eyes. She was sitting with her back against something solid. She tried to move her hands, and couldn't. They were bound behind her rope rather than zip ties rough fiber that had already worked itself into the skin of her wrists. She kept her eyes closed for another 10 seconds and listened. The hum. Somewhere nearby, a drip of water, slow and irregular. Further away, muffled something that might have been Ranger, not barking. Something lower and more sustained, the sound a working dog makes when it is physically restrained and knows it. She opened her eyes. The room was small and built rather than natural member framing. Packed dirt walls, a single bare bulb on a wire above her that threw everything in stark yellow light and heavy shadow. Shelving along the right wall held canned goods, most of them with recent labels. A camp stove, a water container, the kind with a tap. On the left wall, coils of electrical wire ran toward the back of the room, and disappeared through a gap in the timber framing. Margot registered all of it in about 4 seconds, the way she'd been trained to assess a room before doing anything else. Then she registered the shelf directly across from her. On it, between a row of canned soup and a folded emergency blanket, was a radio. Military surplus, older model, but maintained no dust on the casing, the antenna fully extended. The same model Jim had used in the field for the last 3 years of his service. Not civilian surplus. Not the kind of thing you found at an Army-Navy store. She looked at it for a long time. Then she started working on the rope. Jim had taught her the technique during their second year together in the living room of their apartment at Camp Lejeune on a Sunday afternoon while it rained outside. He'd been matter-of-fact about it, the way he was about most practical things. She'd thought at the time that he was just teaching her something useful, the way couples teach each other to cook or change a tire. She wondered now how long he'd known she would need it. The rope was tight, but the knot was behind her, and whoever had tied it knew basic restraint, but not the specific counter techniques. It took her 11 minutes. She knew because she counted her breaths to stay calm, 4 in and 4 out, and she kept track. When her hands came free, she sat still for 30 seconds before she moved, listening. The hum, the drip. Ranger's low, sustained sound from somewhere to her left beyond the wall. She stood, let the blood return to her hands, and moved to the shelf. The radio had power. A faint green light on the panel indicated standby mode. She found the frequency dial and turned it slowly, watching the display until she reached the emergency band. She pressed the transmit button. Static. Then a dispatcher's voice, thin and surprised. "This is Flathead County Dispatch. Go ahead." She kept her voice low and even. She gave her name, her location as precisely as she could, and Corbett's name. She said the words that would make them understand this was not a routine call. She heard the dispatcher's tone change, heard the shift from routine to alert, and she said, "The 2 girls are here. Alive. Coldwater Hollow. Send everything." The signal broke apart before she heard the confirmation. She set the radio down and moved to the door. It opened inward. She eased it back an inch and listened. A corridor timber line lit by more bare bulbs spaced at intervals. The hum was louder here, coming from the far end. The sound of Ranger was louder too, coming from a door on the left, maybe 30 feet ahead. She moved. Ranger was chained to an iron stake driven into the packed earth floor of a second small room. The chain gave him about 4 feet of range. When she came through the door, he stopped making noise, immediately went from that sustained, controlled distress to complete stillness in a single second, watching her, reading her, recalibrating. She found the chain's release and unclipped it. He pressed against her knee once. She put her hand on his head once. Then he moved to the door and looked back at her with his ears forward. She followed. He led her past the corridor and through a turn she wouldn't have found on her own, and then through a low opening in the timber framing that required her to duck, and into a space that was neither room nor tunnel, but something between a widening and the rock, natural, rather than constructed, with a packed earth floor and walls that were partly limestone and partly old wooden shoring. In the far corner, in the shadow where the light from the corridor barely reached, 2 figures were huddled together. One of them heard Ranger's nails on the dirt floor and made a sound, not a cry, not a word, something that preceded language, something that was only relief compressed into a single syllable. Margot moved toward them. She crouched down. The older girl was on her feet before Margot reached her, moving in front of the younger one in a gesture so automatic and practiced, it was clear she'd been doing it for a long time. She was 14 years old. Margot knew that because she'd done the arithmetic 10 years old 4 years ago, and she looked tall and too thin, and with eyes that had learned a specific kind of watchfulness that children's eyes shouldn't have to learn. She looked at Ranger, then at Margot. "Are you real?" she said. Her voice was rough from disuse. "I'm real." "We heard the dog," the girl said. "Every night for the last week, sometimes we heard a dog barking from up on the ridge. Emmy said it was getting closer." She stopped. Her jaw worked. Emmy was right. The younger girl appeared from behind her. 12 years old now, what had been 8 years old when the world stopped making sense for her. She was smaller than seemed, right pale, with dark eyes that were huge in her face and fixed on Ranger with an expression of such concentrated hope it was almost painful to look at directly. "Emmy," Margot said gently, "my name is Margot. This is Ranger. We came to take you home." Emmy looked at her. Then she looked at Ranger again. Then she started to cry. Not dramatically, not the way fear releases itself, but the way relief does, which is quieter and goes on longer and is connected to something deeper. Ranger moved to her and put his nose against her hand. She gripped his fur with both hands and held on. "Sadie," Margot said, looking at the older girl, "is there anyone else in here? Anyone else he has down here?" Sadie shook her head. "Just us. He comes twice a day usually, morning and evening. He's been here once already today." "How long ago?" "2 hours, maybe." "Any other exits? Anything you found?" Sadie looked at her with an expression that said she'd been cataloging exits since the first week. "There's a vent shaft on the north side, too small to fit through, but it comes out in the trees above the hollow. We've been passing things through it." She paused. "The notes, the bracelet." Margot looked at her. "You were the one putting them out. Every time he left the main door open long enough. I've been doing it for 2 years." Sadie's voice was flat and factual, stripped of any quality that would invite pity. "I didn't know if anyone would ever find them, but I thought someone might come. If someone came, they'd need to know where to look." Margot looked at this child, this 14-year-old, who had been planning and hoping and leaving evidence, trails in the dark for 2 years, and felt something move through her chest that she didn't have a name for. "Someone came," she said. She got them both to their feet. Sadie was steadier than she expected. Emmy was unsteady, but determined, keeping one hand in Ranger's fur as they moved. Margot led them back through the low opening and into the corridor, moving quickly, listening ahead. The main door was 30 feet ahead. They were 20 feet from it when it opened. Vec came through alone without the person who had hit her. He stopped when he saw them, and for 1 second his face was completely unguarded. And what she saw in it in that second was not anger and not threat. It was something she hadn't expected. It was despair. Then it closed back over, and he was Roland Vec again, standing in the corridor with his body blocking the exit. "You can't take them out," he said. "Margot, you don't understand what happens if you do." "Step aside, Roland. There are people watching this facility. Not me, not my people. They have surveillance in the trees. They have monitoring on the road. The moment these girls appear outside, there will be a response. A response I cannot control and you cannot stop. Step aside. You think this ends with you walking out of here. It doesn't. It ends with 2 dead children and everyone who tried to help them, and a story about a tragic accident that the county accepts because the alternative is too complicated to deal with." He looked at Sadie, then Emmy, and something moved across his face that was harder to dismiss than she wanted it to be. "I have kept them alive for 4 years. I'm the only reason—" "You kept them prisoner," Margot said. "I kept them breathing." Those are not the same thing. The silence in the corridor was absolute except for the hum. Ranger stepped forward, not toward Vec, just forward, putting himself at Margot's knee, his body angled slightly ahead of hers. A positioning she recognized. Not aggression, statement. Vec looked at the dog for the first time. Something shifted. "There's a way out on the east side," he said. "Further along the main corridor, right turn 40 feet. Emergency exit that comes out on the upper slope above the hollow. It's not monitored. I built it before they installed the surveillance." He paused. "I built it because I knew this day might come." "Why are you telling me this?" He looked at Sadie again. The despair was back, less controlled, now older looking. "Because she looks like she did when she was 10, he said, "and I have not slept properly in 4 years. Margot held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she moved. She took Emmy's hand and looked at Sadie. Stay close. She moved past Vec. He stepped aside, barely just enough, and into the main corridor, moving fast now. No longer quiet, past the room where she'd been held, past the shelf with the radio, past two more doors she didn't open to the right turn Vec had described. 40 feet. Emergency door, steel simple latch, no power required. She hit the latch, and the door swung out, and the cold came through like a wall. Snow. It had started the way the sky had promised. Thin and fast-driven sideways by a wind that had found the upper slope and was using it. The light was nearly gone. Late afternoon had become early evening, somewhere while she was underground. Margot oriented herself by the ridgeline and moved. Ranger went first, finding footing on the icy slope, looking back to track their pace. Emmy stumbled twice, and both times Margot caught her. Sadie moved without help, without complaint, her face set in an expression of determination, so ingrained it had become her resting state. They climbed. The hollow fell away below them as they gained the slope, the canyon walls shrinking into the gray and white of the storm. Margot could see the ridge above 300 feet, 200. The pines thickening as they climbed the snow, softening the ground enough to find grip. She heard Ranger's bark change. He was 20 feet ahead at the crest of the slope, and the bark was different now. Not alarm, not threat, but the specific cadence she had learned meant he'd found something he recognized as safe. She pushed harder, pulling Emmy up the last steep section, and came over the ridge crest into the trees. Corbett's truck was on the logging road 50 yards east, headlights on engine running. Corbett was outside it, his flashlight sweeping the tree line, his voice carrying through the snow. She called back. He came through the trees at a run for a man of 62 and stopped when he saw the girls. She watched everything he'd been carrying for the last hour move across his face at once, the fear, the relief, the professional composure catching up half a second behind. He looked at Sadie, then Emmy, then Margot. "Get them in the truck," he said. She was moving them toward the vehicle when the sound came. Not from behind them, from below, from the road that wound down the valley toward Ridgemont. A sound she recognized without needing to think about it, the way you recognize certain sounds when they've been part of your life long enough to live in your body rather than your memory. Explosion, then another. Then the specific percussion of a vehicle's fuel tank, which is different from all other explosions and unmistakable once you've heard it. She turned. Down the valley, maybe half a mile, 3 sets of headlights that had been moving up the road were now stopped. 2 of them were burning. Corbett's backup. She watched the firelight rising through the snow orange against gray, and she watched the dark shapes moving at the perimeter of the burning vehicles with the specific precision of people who move in tactical formation because it is the only way they know how to move. Corbett was beside her. "That's my backup," he said. His voice was steady, but his breathing wasn't. "I know. There were 3 units. I called them from the ridge." "I know." She watched the shapes moving in the valley, counting. 7, 8 more in the trees on the eastern slope, hard to see visible, only by the intermittent reflection of firelight on equipment. Corbett said something else, but she wasn't listening to him anymore. She was listening to footsteps behind her, coming up through the trees from the direction of the hollow's upper slope. She turned. Vec came out of the tree line and stopped when he saw the burning vehicles in the valley. He looked at them for a long time. The snow was coming down steadily now, settling on his shoulders and in his hair, and he stood in it like a man who has stopped trying to find shelter. "I didn't call them," he said. He wasn't talking to Margot specifically. He was saying it to the air the way people say things they need said even when no one needs to hear them. "I didn't call them. They were already watching." "They're always watching." He looked at Margot. The man she saw on his face now was not the man who had blocked the corridor and not the man who had organized 200 volunteers 4 years ago and told a town of grieving people it was time to stop looking. The man she saw now was simply exhausted in the deep particular way that people become exhausted when they have been living with something terrible for a very long time and have finally run out of the resources to keep it standing. Helios, he said, that's who they work for. That's who built that facility. That's who those girls were brought here for. He paused. I was the caretaker. I was supposed to maintain the site and keep it quiet. I didn't know what the site was for until the second month. And by then, he stopped. By then you were already in it, Margot said. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. From the valley below came the sound of more vehicles. And further away underneath the wind, something she felt more than heard, a low rhythmic vibration in the ground beneath her feet. Too consistent to be the storm, too deep to be the burning vehicles. Ranger pressed against her leg and looked up at her. She put her hand on his head and looked at Vec. Start talking, she said. All of it. Right now. Vec talked for 11 minutes. He talked the way men talk when they have been holding something for too long, and the weight has finally exceeded what the body can carry, not with relief exactly, but with the flat, exhausted precision of a man dictating a report he knows will be used against him and no longer cares. Margot listened without interrupting. Helios Defense, a private contractor with government relationships deep enough that the distinction between the two had become largely ceremonial. Project Sentinel officially canceled in 2019, officially defunded, officially dismantled. The cancellation had been real in every way that could be documented and audited and shown to a congressional committee. Everything else had moved here. The facility beneath Coldwater Hollow had been operational for 6 years. Vec had been approached 3 years before the girls disappeared, approached carefully over months by men who understood how to make an arrangement sound like an opportunity and an opportunity sound like the reasonable thing any reasonable man would do. He'd been paid well. He'd been told the site was a data collection facility. Atmospheric monitoring, he had been told. Environmental research, he'd believed it long enough to make the believing comfortable. When did you find out the truth? Margot said. 8 months in, Vec said. I found a file I wasn't supposed to find. Project Sentinel wasn't atmospheric research. It was behavioral modeling. They were building something, an AI system designed to operate in environments where human soldiers couldn't or wouldn't. Not a drone, not a weapon system. Something that could make decisions. Tactical decisions. The kind of decisions that require understanding human fear and human response and human breaking points. He paused. They needed data, he said. Real data, not simulated. Long-term observation of human subjects under sustained psychological stress in controlled isolation. The snow came down steadily around them. The burning vehicles in the valley had peaked and were subsiding now, the orange light thinning to a dull red pulse through the trees. The girls, Margot said, they were chosen because they were young enough to adapt and old enough to generate useful data, because they were from a small community where disappearances could be attributed to terrain, because he stopped, his jaw worked, because no one with enough power was going to push hard enough to find them. Corbett made a sound beside her that wasn't words. I tried to leave, Vec said. Oh, Nanipai. Twice. The second time a man I'd never met before came to my ranch and sat in my kitchen and told me what would happen to the girls if I wasn't here to maintain the site. He was very calm about it, very specific. He looked at the ground. Oh, so I stayed, and I kept them fed, and I kept them warm, and I told myself that was something, that it was better than the alternative. He looked up. It wasn't better than the alternative. I know that. I have known that for a long time. Margot looked at him for a moment. Who is the man at the top of this, she said. Not the handlers, not the men in the valley, the person who runs Sentinel. His name is Harlan Creed, Vec said. Director level. He doesn't come here often. He was here 6 days ago. He'll know by now that the site is compromised. He paused. He'll be coming back. From the valley below came a new sound engines, more of them moving up the access road with the kind of unhurried confidence that belongs to people who understand they have overwhelming advantage and see no reason to hurry. Corbett put his hand on Margot's arm. We need to move these girls. She looked at Sadie and Emmy standing together at the edge of the tree line. Emmy had her hand in the ranger's fur again, her face turned toward the valley lights. Sadie was watching Margot with those two old eyes reading the situation, waiting. How far to the ranger station on Pine Creek? Margot asked Corbett. 4 miles east on the old logging road, if the road's clear. Take the girls. Take your truck. She looked at him steadily. Don't stop for anything. Margot, get them to Pine Creek. Get them in. Find a signal and use it. She held his gaze. Do you understand? Corbett looked at the valley. He looked at the girls. He looked at her face, which was giving him no room to negotiate. 4 miles, he said. Go now, before those vehicles reach the ridge road. He moved. Sadie went without being asked. She had understood the situation before Corbett started moving. Emmy looked at Ranger and then at Margot. Is he coming? Emmy said. Margot crouched down to her eye level. He'll find you, she said. He always finds the people he needs to find. Go with Deputy Shea. Emmy held Ranger's gaze for one more second. Then she turned and followed Corbett into the trees. Margot listened to the truck engine turn over and the headlights sweep through the pines as Corbett navigated east on the logging road. She listened until the engine sound faded into the storm. Then she turned to Vec. The facility, she said. Take me down. He looked at her. You understand what's in there. Take me down. Creed will... I'm not asking about Creed, she said. I'm asking you to take me into that facility right now and show me everything. Documents, files, whatever Helios has stored down there. She looked at him without blinking. Because when this is over, I need something that can't be buried. Something that proves what was done in that hole and who gave the orders. Otherwise, those girls spent 4 years underground for nothing, and whatever Creed builds next just goes somewhere else and does it again to someone else's children. Vec was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned toward the hollow. They went down through the emergency exit back into the warmth and the hum moving faster this time. Vec led and Margot followed with Ranger close at her heel through the corridor past the room she'd already seen further than she'd been before, further into the mountain. The corridor widened as they went deeper. What had been rough timber, framing, and packed earth gave way to poured concrete and industrial lighting. The hum grew louder, gaining complexity. It wasn't one machine, but many layered the sound of infrastructure. The air changed too, losing the damp earth smell and taking on something cooler and more neutral, the specific quality of air that has been processed and recirculated for a long time. Vec stopped at a steel door marked with a designation she recognized from his confession, H13. He pressed a code into a keypad, 6 digits without hesitation. The door opened. The room beyond was nothing like the rough utility of the outer tunnels. It was large, warehouse-sized, carved directly into the bedrock and reinforced with concrete and steel. Banks of computer terminals ran along 3 walls, most of them dark, but some showing active displays, screensavers cycling through data readouts. Overhead industrial lights hung from a grid. At the far end of the room, dominating the space the way an altar dominates a cathedral, stood a cylindrical structure 8 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter, encased in tempered glass filled with a pulsing blue-white light. The hum was loudest here. It vibrated in the fillings of her back teeth. Ranger stopped just inside the door. He didn't growl. He simply stopped and stood and looked at the cylinder with the particular stillness he used when he encountered something that fell outside of his established categories of the world. Margot looked at it too. That's the core, Vec said. The processing architecture. Sentinel doesn't live in the servers just feed it. The core is where it actually runs. He paused. It's been running continuously for 4 years. It's never been shut down. Not once. The girls, Margot said. 4 years of observing them. What did it learn? Vec was quiet for a moment. Everything, he said. It learned everything. She pulled her eyes from the cylinder and moved to the nearest active terminal. The screen showed a cascading series of data logs, timestamps running back years, organized into categories. She had to read carefully before they resolved into meaning. Behavioral metrics, response mapping, adaptive modeling, and at the top of the screen, the project identifier. Sentinel Phase 4. Active. She took her phone from her jacket pocket. The screen showed no signal, which she had expected. She opened the camera instead and started photographing. Screen after screen, every document within reach, every label on every piece of equipment. The physical files, she said to Vec. Where are they? He moved to a cabinet against the left wall steel industrial, locked with a physical key he kept on a ring in his coat pocket. He unlocked it. Inside were binders each labeled with a date range spanning 6 years. She took photographs of every spine. Then she opened the most recent binder and photographed every page. She had been at it for 4 minutes when Ranger turned toward the door. He didn't bark. He simply turned and his spine went up and his tail dropped to the precise horizontal that meant not alarm, but readiness, the posture of an animal that has assessed a situation and determined that what comes next will require everything it has. Margot pocketed her phone and turned. Director Harlan Creed walked through the door of H13 with 2 men behind him and the unhurried ease of someone entering a room he owns, which is exactly what he was doing. He was older than she'd pictured from Vec's description, late 60s, heavy through the chest with white hair cropped close and a face that had settled into a kind of permanent executive composure. He wore a dark coat over a jacket and tie, which struck her as a specific kind of statement, the clothes of a man who intends to be in control of whatever situation he enters, regardless of conditions. He looked at Margot. He looked at Vec. He looked at Ranger. He did not look alarmed. Mrs. Hale, he said, his voice was measured the cadence of a man who chose each word after brief consideration and discarded the ones that cost too much. This is a significant trespass. Harlan Creed, she said, you've been doing your homework. He glanced at Vec. Roland. The single word carried a weight of disappointed finality that was more damning than anything louder would have been. Vec said nothing. Creed moved further into the room and his 2 men staying near the door, not advancing, just present, establishing the geometry of the situation. He stopped near one of the active terminals and looked at the screen with the expression of a man checking something he already knows. You've been photographing the facility, he said. I have. No signal down here. Whatever you've taken stays on the device until you're above ground. He looked at her directly, which presents an obvious problem for your plans. Then I'll need to get above ground. That seems unlikely in the near term. He said it without particular emphasis, the way you state a fact about weather. He moved toward the cylinder, standing beside it, the blue light catching the planes of his face. Let me tell you what's going to happen, Mrs. Hale, because I think you deserve honesty given what you've accomplished today. You found 2 children that no one else found. That's a genuine achievement. Your husband would have been proud. The mention of Jim landed like a hand around her throat. She kept her face still. Jim, she said, you knew him. I knew of him. He was thorough and he was intelligent and he found something he shouldn't have found and he reported it to someone he shouldn't have trusted. Creed's voice remained even. That's a tragedy. Genuinely. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. The room was very quiet except for the hum. You had him killed, Margot said. I had a problem managed, Creed said. The distinction matters to me, even if it doesn't to you. Ranger made a sound she had never heard from him before. Not a growl, not a bark, something lower and more continuous. A sound from deep in the chest that seemed less like threat assessment and more like grief. She put her hand on his head without looking down. Jim knew about this facility, she said. It wasn't a question. He came across coordinates during an intelligence collection operation that overlapped with our perimeter. He was meticulous. He cross-referenced them. He filed a report. Creed paused. The report reached us before it reached anyone else. These things are arranged in advance. She thought about the map in the cabin, the red circle above Coldwater Hollow. Jim's voice just keeping track. He'd known something was wrong here. He'd been tracking it quietly the way he tracked everything methodically, without announcing himself building a picture before he committed to it. And someone had seen him building it before he could finish. He had given her Ranger because he knew. Not because he was afraid, because he trusted her to follow where he couldn't go anymore. The files I photographed, Margot said, the data logs, 4 years of what you did to those children, that exists now outside this facility. On a device with no signal, Creed said. For the moment, he studied her. You're trying to determine whether I'll let you walk out of here. I'm determining what you think your options are. Something shifted in his expression, a fractional adjustment, the kind that happens when a person recalculates. My options are straightforward. The girls are already gone. I'm aware of that. We've been tracking the deputy's vehicle since he reached the logging road. Recovering them creates complications that are greater than the benefit at this stage. The facility, however, and the documentation you've collected, Roland, Margot said without taking her eyes off Creed. Vec moved. He crossed the room in 7 steps and reached the emergency shutdown panel on the far wall, a red-cased box recessed into the concrete behind a hinged cover. He pulled the cover open. His hand went to the main breaker. One of Creed's men moved toward him. Ranger went for the man's leg before he'd covered half the distance. 70 pounds of trained Malinois hitting a moving target at full extension. The man went down hard. The second man raised his weapon. Margot was already moving. She hit him at the shoulder before the weapon came level, driving him into the terminal bank. His head met the edge of the steel casing, and he went down and stayed down. Creed turned toward her. She had his man's weapon. Now she'd taken it in the same motion, the way you'd take things when the motion has been trained into muscle memory over enough years that thinking about it would only slow it down. She leveled it at Creed. He looked at the weapon. He looked at her face. He looked at Vec standing at the shutdown panel with his hand on the breaker. If you activate that, Creed said to Vec with remarkable composure, 6 years of research is gone. Sentinel reverts to last backup. Everything built in this facility. Do it, Margot said. Vec pulled the breaker. The lights went out. For 3 seconds, the room was completely dark, and the hum, which had been so constant and pervasive that it had stopped registering as sound and become simply the ambient condition of the space, wound down through its frequencies and stopped. The silence it left behind was extraordinary, the kind of silence that has texture. Then the emergency lighting came on dim red panels in the ceiling enough to see by. The cylinder's blue light was gone. The terminals were dark. The room felt emptied of something that had been occupying it in a way that had nothing to do with electricity. Ranger came to Margot's side. She heard him more than saw him in the red dimness. Creed had not moved. In the emergency lighting, his face was different, older, more angular, stripped of the executive composure by something she couldn't immediately identify. Then she recognized it. He was looking at the dark cylinder, and what was on his face was loss. The specific expression of someone watching something they built go dark. Roland, Margot said, go. East corridor, emergency exit, same way we came down. Go now. Vec looked at her. You pulled the breaker, she said. That's the only thing that mattered. Go. He went. His footsteps receded through the dark corridor. Margot kept the weapon on Creed. Creed looked at her with the dim red light on his face and said nothing for a moment. Then, you understand this doesn't end here. Sentinel's architecture exists in distributed backups across 4 facilities. Shutting this down sets the program back. It doesn't stop it. It stops it here. The data from those girls is evidence now, she said. Everything on my phone, everything Sadie and Emmy will say when they're sitting in front of people who are paid to write things down. Everything Roland Vec will say when he decides that the truth is the only thing he has left to trade. She took a step toward him. You had my husband killed Creed. You put two children in a hole in the ground for 4 years and called it research. Whatever comes next for Sentinel, this particular version of it is over. And you are going to answer for what happened in this room. Something moved in his face, not fear, not quite. Something older. Your husband sent a letter, Creed said, before the end. Did you know that? She said nothing. He sent it to Vec, not to you. He was protecting Yifriao. Creed's voice was very even. He wrote that if anyone ever found this place, it would be his wife. He said it with complete certainty. A pause. He was right. The room began to tremble. Not violently, just a low building vibration in the floor and walls. The kind of tremor that precedes structural failure, the delayed consequence of the shutdown, cascading through systems that had been designed to operate continuously and were not designed to stop. Dust fell from the ceiling. Ranger barked once sharp, urgent, the single bark that meant now. Creed turned and walked toward the far exit with the unhurried movement of a man who has prepared for this contingency, which she understood in that moment he had. He had an exit she didn't know about. He was going to use it. She let him go. She turned and ran. Ranger was ahead of her, already in the corridor, moving fast in the red emergency light. The trembling in the walls was deepening. She could feel it in her sternum now, the mountain adjusting to the absence of whatever Sentinel had been doing inside it. Pipes groaned somewhere above. A section of timber framing shed its packing and dust cascaded through the corridor, Raider in a brown curtain. She ran, past the dark terminals of H-13, past the rooms she'd been held in, past the shelf where the military radio still sat silent now, through the low opening that required her to duck through the rough outer tunnels that smelled of earth and old wood. The emergency exit was 40 feet ahead. The floor lurched. She hit the wall with her shoulder, caught herself, kept moving. Ranger was at the door. He hit it with both paws and it swung outward, and cold air and snowflakes came through, and she went through it without slowing down. Outside, the cold hit her like a correction. Clean air, sharp with pine and snow after the recirculated underground air. She came out on the upper slope of the hollow's east wall, above the burned juniper, above the canyon floor, and she ran uphill without stopping because the mountain behind her was still trembling. 20 feet above the exit, she stopped and turned. The ground around the emergency door shifted, settled. The door frame canted, and the door fell inward, and a section of the hillside above it compressed downward by 2 feet, as though something beneath had exhaled and not inhaled again. A low rumble ran through the rock, traveled up through the soles of her boots, and faded. Then it was quiet. Snow fell on a hillside that looked from the outside like a hillside. Ranger sat beside her. They both looked at it for a moment. She reached into her jacket pocket and found her phone. 3% battery. She held it up above her head and walked 10 feet east, and then 15 feet further east, and then she had one bar, and she made the call before the bar could disappear. The dispatcher picked up on the second ring. She gave her location. She gave Corbett's name and the Pine Creek Ranger Station. She gave the name Harlan Creed and the name Helios Defense. She said the words federal jurisdiction, and she said the words two surviving minors. And she said the words, I have documentation, and she kept talking until the battery indicator on her phone turned red. Then she lowered the phone and stood in the snow. Ranger pressed against her leg. The valley below was quieter now. The burning vehicles had subsided to a dull glow. She could see headlights on the road further south. Different vehicles, more of them the spread and pattern of an official response rather than a tactical operation. Someone had reached the right people. Corbett, maybe, or the dispatch call she'd made from the underground radio. She thought about Jim. She thought about him standing at that map in the cabin, drawing that red circle with careful precision, knowing something was wrong in the hollow below, and not knowing yet how wrong. She thought about him making his report to the wrong person and having 2 weeks left after that, 2 weeks of whatever he knew and whatever he was deciding, and then sending Ranger home to her. He'd known. He'd known, and he'd sent her the one thing that would lead her here to this hillside on this night 4 years later. She looked down at Ranger. He looked back at her. His amber eyes were calm in the way they were always calm after the work was done, not relaxed, never fully relaxed, but settled, present, ready. He knew you'd find it, she said quietly. He knew you'd find them. Ranger's tail moved once, just once. She stood there for another minute, letting her breathing slow, letting the cold work its way through her coat and into her, properly grounding her in the physical reality of the hillside and the snow and the valley below, where people were moving with lights and purpose. Then she walked down toward the logging road. Corbett's truck was at the Pine Creek Ranger Station when she arrived on foot 40 minutes later, along with two county vehicles she didn't recognize and an ambulance with its lights running. The ranger station's windows were lit. Through the glass, she could see people moving inside, could see the specific, efficient motion of EMTs around two small figures wrapped in emergency blankets. She stopped outside the door. Through the window, she could see Sadie sitting upright on a cot, talking to a woman in a county jacket, her hands moving as she spoke with the focused intensity of someone who has been waiting to say something for a very long time and has finally been given a room that can hold it. Emmy was beside her, wrapped in a blanket that reached her chin. An EMT was checking her pulse. Emmy wasn't looking at the EMT, she was looking at the door. When Margot opened it, Emmy looked at Ranger. The girl's face did something complicated and then simplified into a single expression that was mostly relief and partly the specific exhaustion of a 12-year-old who has been afraid for 4 years and has just been told she can stop. Ranger crossed the room to her. Corbett appeared from the side of the room. He had a bandage on his left forearm that hadn't been there before, and he was favoring his right side, but he was standing and he was moving. And when he reached her, he looked at her face and said nothing for a moment. Creed got out, she said. I know, we've got a description out. Federal channels. He stopped. It's complicated. It's going to stay complicated for a while. Yes, he paused. Vex surrendered at the access road, walking. He flagged down the first county vehicle he reached. She nodded. The girls, she said. Sadie's been talking since before the EMTs arrived. He paused, looking for the right word. She's extraordinary. Yes, Margot said, she is. She looked across the room at the two girls and the people surrounding them with blankets and careful voices and the specific professional warmth of people who work in emergency response and understand that the first hour of safety matters as much as the rescue itself. She didn't go in. She stayed at the threshold and watched, which was the right thing to do. This moment did not belong to her. It belonged to Sadie and Emmy, and to the 4 years of dark they had endured, and to the people in that room who were trained for exactly this. Corbett stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Margot's radio, Corbett's spare, which he'd handed her on the walk over, clicked twice, and a voice came through asking for her position. She gave it. The voice said federal agents were en route and would she remain on site. She said yes. The voice asked for the name Harlan Creed to be confirmed, and she confirmed it. The voice said the name Helios Defense, and the voice's tone when it said it told her that the name was not unknown. She clipped the radio back to her jacket. Corbett looked at her. How deep does this go? I don't know yet, she said, but I have documentation. He nodded slowly. Jim, he said carefully, you learned something tonight. Yes. Are you all right? She thought about the answer honestly, the way Jim had always told her to think about answers before she gave them, not to find the version that sounded best, but to find the version that was true. Not yet, she said, but I will be. Ranger came to the door and sat beside her, having apparently determined that Emmy was safe and that his next obligation was to his handler. He sat with his shoulder against her calf, warm and present and solid. Outside, the snow had stopped. The clouds had broken apart the way they sometimes do after a storm, suddenly and completely, and the stars were out hard and clear, and very far away the way stars are above mountains in winter when the air is clean. Margot stood in the doorway and looked at them. Somewhere beneath the ground she had just walked across in the dark, in the silence of a facility that was no longer running, something had stopped. Something that had been built to learn everything there was to know about fear had finally been made quiet. She thought about Creed's last words to her. 4 facilities, distributed backups, whatever comes next for Sentinel. She thought about the red circle on Jim's map drawn with care and purpose, left for someone who would understand what it meant. She thought about Ranger finding the bracelet in the frozen earth and Sadie spending 2 years passing notes through a ventilation shaft, and Emmy counting days by the sound of a dog barking on the ridge above her. The faint tremor moved through the ground beneath her feet, very slight, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't paying attention, if you hadn't spent enough time learning to read the terrain beneath you. She felt it. She looked down at Ranger. He was looking at the mountains, not toward the hollow specifically, just at the mountains, the long, dark ridge line against the star-filled sky, the snow-covered slopes, the deep country that extended north and east and went on for a very long way before it became anything else. Listening, Margot put her hand on his head. She thought about what came next, the federal agents, the statements, the long, slow machinery of accountability grinding into motion around a name and an organization that would fight every inch of the way. She thought about Vec in custody talking. She thought about the photographs on her phone, the binders she documented, the 6 years of records that existed now outside the facility that had tried to contain them. She thought about Jim, who had started pulling on a thread 4 years ago and had handed it to her without being able to tell her why. She thought about what it meant to finish something for someone you loved. The stars were very clear. "Okay," she said quietly. Ranger looked up at her. "I know," she said. "I hear it too." She stayed in the doorway a little longer, warm light behind her and cold sky ahead, her hand on the dog that Jim had sent home the mountains silent, and the ground beneath them not quite as silent as it looked. She didn't look away.